into some chat about those low carbohydrate diets. So you conducted some research, Sam, one of your papers in 2019, which is when you kind of started with Team Novo Nordisk. Carbohydrate restriction in type 1 diabetes, a realistic therapy for improved glycemic control and athletic performance. So Drew basically gave us an overview of his experiences with being diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, then being referred to, what you consider your general healthy diet. He kind of was a bit hesitant or had his reservations as to why he would follow a diet of this nature. And so he went through a whole journey of trialing the keto diet, paleo diet, and he's gone full circle back to vegetarian. So he's sampled all variations of different diets and found what works best for him. But one of the things that I discussed with Drew when he was talking about the keto and the paleo diets was just the risk of hypoglycemia, and how being on a low carbohydrate diet for many people potentially listening to this podcast, not being at that elite level, but living with type 1 diabetes and getting into physical activity and exercise, how they would interpret these messages. For a lot of them, it would seem to be of health concern for them to be running these low carbohydrate diets of an evening after exercise, going to bed, and potentially having nocturnal hypoglycemia or a delayed onset hypo. What would be your, takeaways from this paper and your, messages for those out there that are potentially struggling with their glucose management? What would be the right approach for managing exercise and glycemic control if they are concerned about hypos, after exercise or throughout the evening?
Yeah, so that paper was written. I was really, really enthusiastic about this topic and found it really fascinating. And I was really keen to do a lot of projects and research around this area and look at it properly. It's really difficult to get funding to look at these projects. It's very expensive to do it properly, and to really test what you're looking at in a group that are not too small or not particularly too kind of selective or something like that. It's really, really hard to do. But I started off with this asking questions. The first was from a really high performance sporting level, which is what we discussed earlier, which was about seeing athletes and seeing a lot of research projects that have been done in athletes without type 1 diabetes that were using these strategies to augment their the adaptive responses to training to kind of increase those responses. And there's quite clear evidence that there's some of these strategies, if you do them right, then you do get better kind of training benefits. Yeah, it was kind of discussing and thinking about the ideas of the practicalities behind that if you're living with type 1 diabetes, because it's not so easy, as we said before. And then the other part of it, which I started off with, was kind of where did this whole idea behind low carbohydrate diets and type 1 diabetes come about? Who started this idea? And basically started looking 100 years ago, before insulin was developed. Insulin became completely necessary for survival for people with type 1 diabetes. If you were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, it almost certainly meant that you would die. The only way in which to survive, and not for that long and not with such a great quality of life, would be to do these extremely low carb diets. So basically avoid carbohydrates completely in the diet, because you're trying to avoid any increases in blood glucose. And they have these examples of diets, which you can find if you search, which are they would boil green beans twice at least. And there was examples where they would give people whiskey not for any energy benefit, but just kind of to help with the discomfort. And then you see that insulin is introduced, and insulin is amazing. It saves lots of people's lives. And then gradually over time, you start to see that the insulin formulations become better. The way in which insulin can be administered becomes better. So you start having this situation where you can introduce carbohydrates, you can increase this, and eventually you have this situation where people with type 1 diabetes, being a kind of at-risk group for like cardiovascular disease and things like that, are suggested don't eat so much fat, eat carbohydrates instead. Fat is bad, fat causes heart disease. And we have insulin, so we can exchange basically carbohydrates for insulin. So it doesn't really matter how much you eat, because you can now exchange it directly. And so we start seeing, especially in kind of in Western cultures, in America in particular, higher carbohydrate diets, recommendations about higher carbohydrate diets, which are just basically exchanged for insulin in order to manage that. And then I guess that this movement has come along kind of saying, well, you can go low carb, and then that's how it forms. And there's people who are very strong advocates of it and insist that it's really useful. And then there's people who have suggested things like keto diets and stuff like that. The problem is that the research in that area, or the projects or studies that have looked at that, tend to be very small sample sizes. They're quite often kind of like survey style things. They're not actually really studies that people have done. They're more like just surveying people and asking, what do you eat? What is your experience of that? What happens to your glucose with that? And people report that they're on these things. It means you're getting, of course, a certain type of person. And within that project as well, we had a look and saw, like, what does somebody have to be eating if they are following one of these keto diets? And they're quite restrictive. They're quite difficult to do. So yeah, I don't want to say that people can't do them, but you have to be very, very dedicated to do something like that. It's not something that you can kind of suggest to lots and lots of people. So my opinion is that there's still work that needs to be done, of course, but that's not the answer that people want. I guess you've just got to be sensible about it. There's other disadvantages of doing something like a keto diet, which mean that you're less responsive to, or you're kind of struggle with carbs if you suddenly have something unexpected on a given day. Like, say if you're keto and then somebody brings in a birthday cake, that's going to be difficult, or something like that.
Yeah, I've been preaching about this for forever. I mean, this is, it's well known, diabetes or not, that when you're on a very, very low carb or ketogenic diet, that your glucose tolerance goes down, and it's transient. And yes, you can reverse it, by introducing carbs back into the diet. But if you really want to stick to a keto diet, and every now and then you have that lapse, your glucose tolerance is not as good. And it can be pretty tricky with people who have diabetes to then manage their blood glucose on that off occasion when they have a day that's higher carb, or even just one meal that's higher carb. I will say, though, in my case, when I was on a lower carb diet, whether it was keto or just like a low carb kind of paleo diet where I was eating up to about 130 grams of carbs a day, I had way less hypos than I do now. I have more hypos now on a higher carb diet than I did before, just due to my insulin sensitivity being, significantly increased compared to back then. So I can see utility in all of these different dietary frameworks. I just think that it comes down to the individual understanding their personal response to these diets and what are their goals. If you correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're an athlete who is doing very glycolytic sports, being in a ketogenic state long term is probably not going to benefit you when it comes to those high intensity bouts or efforts. So I can see cycles of it working. So, you know, maybe it's like a period in your, if you can periodize your training and go low carb for a little bit, I can see that working. But I can't get around the idea that somebody can be in ketosis for multiple years and really be optimizing their performance if they're in a glycolytic sport. I mean, I haven't looked into the research deeply, but I'd love to hear what you think about that concept of being in a ketogenic state for years and years and years and trying to compete in a glycolytic high intensity sport at the highest level.
Yeah, I think it's completely down to personal, like your goals, how you want to live your life as well, how restrictive you want to be. From a sporting point of view, if you're doing something that demands high energy demand, like an endurance sport or something, especially if you have to do more like kind of sprints or something like that, you need carbs. The carbs is essential. You can't get away without it. Athletes who don't have diabetes are eating tons and tons of carbs for events such as cycling, running. Yeah, those things are absolutely essential. Also, just a general kind of thing. It's like how much restriction you want to put on yourself, the kind of life that you want to live, and how you want to kind of approach your diet. And it's very important that you don't kind of over fixate on those things, because that can be dangerous as well. I think that personally, I think that food is kind of something that you should enjoy as well, and placing too many restrictions on that can be not too good for just kind of general life enjoyment. I think there's ways to manage type 1 diabetes for sure with all kinds of diets. It's possible to do whatever you want, but why add more pressure than there needs to be already? It's already challenging enough.
So there's a lot of training information and research out there that suggests that there are some metabolic adaptation advantages and benefits from training low. You know, a lot of ultra endurance athletes run on very low carbohydrate diets, and they found that they can't run at the same intensities for as long, but they can sustain lower intensities of running for much longer periods of time. So I guess it supports them in their goals, as Drew was sort of talking to there. But the concept of train low, sleep low, for someone with type 1 diabetes, this is a bit of a trade-off between risk and reward. Is that kind of what you pulled out of this paper, and kind of where's that happy medium where you can get some good performance adaptations, but I guess where do you draw the line? Where does it start to become detrimental to the individual's recovery or their performance on the bike?
I think with type 1 diabetes, the priority always has to be glucose management, because it's safety. Well, first of all, it's safety first. But also, if you do experience highs and lows, you're just not going to perform as well. Full stop. Like if you have the best training session the day before, and then you go low overnight, you're just not going to feel good at all tomorrow. Besides from the risk associated with that low, you're just not going to feel good at all. You're not going to get a decent training session in the next day. So you've got to really make sure that is done as well as you can in terms of the glucose management. There's certainly ways to do it. It's just planning. It's just knowing your body. It's easier said than done, of course, but lots of people manage to do it. Just careful planning, understanding the amount of insulin that you require, how much you need to lower your insulin by for overnight. CGMs can be useful again with the alarms overnight. There's other technologies coming through, like closed loop systems, which are systems that automatically regulate your insulin. They kind of speak to your glucose monitor, and there's an algorithm that adjusts the insulin according to what your glucose is doing. And especially overnight, those things can help as well. So yeah, a combination of exploring the best technologies to use, the best strategies to use, knowing what your individual goals are, but I would say always like safety first, because you're just not going to perform if you have a hypo.
And we spoke about at the start how there's so many things to control with someone living with type 1 diabetes: training, nutrition, sleep, insulin, all of those different factors, traveling with insulin, which we haven't even talked about, which is probably an episode in itself.